Before we begin, I want to make you fully aware of two key things. This module tests your synthesis, comparison between rulers and understanding of change continuity, and your level of knowledge. In addition, you must use the whole period, which means you must include the Provisional Government and Khrushchev too. This particular question is a common type of question, with the key focus of the question being the only thing that really changes. Do remember that you are very unlikely to get a question that you can simply regurgitate with some minor adjustments. You're going to have to think on your feet, and I would choose your essay paragraphs very carefully. I would sit there for a minute or two, maybe even 3 during the exam before you set off, because it's better to write 55 minutes worth of an essay in the right direction than 60 minutes in slightly the wrong direction. A lot of what you did for the medieval essays last year should also be features of these essays, such as specialist impressive knowledge, a starting point, a focus on the question, a paragraph summary at the end of every paragraph, different themes for every paragraph, amongst other things. But the biggest difference is that you must synthesize, which means compare. The medieval module asks you to look at things in depth, whereas the Russian module asks you to study a period of over 100 years of Russian history, and what they're looking for there is your understanding and ability to explain that understanding of how things changed and how things stayed similar. For this essay, my paragraph themes, which are based on 6 years of past examiners' reports and recommendations, which you can find for yourself on the OSEA website, my paragraph themes could be on ideology, structure of government, tools of government, local government, repression and control, or elements of democracy. There's overlap with many of these possible themes. For example, the secret police could be seen as a tool of government, but could also go in a paragraph on repression and control. So I probably wouldn't choose both themes. For the sake of this essay podcast, I'm going to choose to talk to you about 1. Ideology, 2. Government structures, 3. Tools of government, and 4, providing of course I've got time, local government. Now I have an outline of my plan. I also need to have a key argument that I can keep in mind through my essay. It's my opinion that the February Revolution, not the October, the February Revolution was a bigger turning point in terms of the Russian government. And because this is my argument, it needs to appear in my intro and in my conclusion, as well as at various points within my essay, so that my argument is supported. And so, to the introduction. Introduction. The events of 1905 were undoubtedly significant in terms of the impact it had on changing Russian government. Yet it was far overshadowed in this respect by the February Revolution of 1917. When assessing Russian government with respect to change, it is important to assess individual aspects of Russian government, and in this case it will be prudent to assess ideology, government structures, tools of government, and local government. An assessment of these show that February 1917 was an occasion on which all 4 of these aspects of Russian government changed, in most respects quite dramatically. Paragraph and theme 1. The ideology of government changed 3 times from 1855 to 1964, and 1905 was not one of those occasions. Therefore, in terms of ideological change, 1905 did not have much impact on changes in Russian government. See, that was my point to the start of what would be a paragraph. I've now got to go and back this up. Before 1905 and afterwards, the Russian government was autocratic, and the majority of it was totally committed to the Tsars, although certain elements of the State Duma were not. Significantly, the members of the State Duma had little real power, and particularly after the release of the fundamental laws in 1906, and then the electoral reform, which came after the dismissal of the Second Duma, power remained in the hands of men who were clearly committed to autocracy. In comparison, the February Revolution saw the overthrow of autocracy and the establishment of the Provisional Government, who publicly stated their intention to rule through democratic means, though of course their promised elections never materialised. The provisional government cannot be seen as autocratic or Bolshevik, though some elements may have held some support for both. And thus, as opposed to 1905, the majority of government, and certainly those with the power, were largely opposed to autocracy, and therefore this signalled a greater change in ideology than the events of 1905. Arguably of equal size in terms of change, ideological change that is, was the October Revolution of 1917, whereby a large body who were publicly committed to democracy were overthrown by a completely new ideological entity and a relatively small Bolshevik elite who served as the vanguard of the revolution. In both February 1917 and October 1917, the ideology of the government changed dramatically, whereas in 1905, only a small aspect of government that had no real power might have had some members that had different ideologies. And thus, in terms of ideology, the events of 1905 changed little compared to the events of 1917. Paragraph and theme 2. Paradoxically to ideologies, the structure of government undoubtedly changed in 1905, though even in this aspect, which was perhaps the most obvious change in 1905, it was not so big an aspect of change as was seen in February and October of 1917. So there's my point. I've now got to back it up with comparisons and with analysis, which is my explained comparisons. The introduction of a State Duma was seen by many as a first step down the path towards a constitutional monarchy, and it constituted the establishment of an elected lower chamber that, whilst it could not propose laws, it could block them. However, it must be recognised that a lot of the structure remained the same, with a Tsar holding supreme power, a council of ministers and a state council, which were all features of government from before 1905, although the state council had been called the Imperial Council of State. It could be argued that the structure of government changed more with the so-called Stalin Constitution of 1936, in which Stalin split the government of the USSR into the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities, which was supposed to give various interest groups more representation on government. But because of the totalitarian nature of Stalin's regime, it was a restructuring that was largely insignificant because power still rested in the hands of one individual, more than it did at any other time from 1855 to 1964. However, as with the issues of ideologies, it was in 1917 that saw the biggest changes in government structure. First, with the provisional government, which was essentially the Fourth Duma, but without the other apparatus of Tsarist government. And the provisional government also had to share significant power with the Petrograd Soviet. So whilst the provisional government was the official government, it was not the only body that controlled the country. This was the most significant change because for the only time in the entire period it can be said that the workers and soldiers were wielding significant power, and that power was not held in the hands of one individual or a small number of elites. October 1917 heralded another change in government structures, but this was a reverse back to structures that were similar to the Tsarist government in many cases. For example, Sovnarkom and the Commissars were essentially the same as the Council of Ministers and Ministers, but with different names. And so to my little summary. In terms of structure, the 1905 revolution forced a significant change in the structure of Russian government, but much remained the same, and this cannot be said for the events of February 1917, which brought in a completely unique government structure for the period 1855 to 1964, because power rested in the hands of a number of people rather than just a small minority. Third paragraph. The tools of government did not change much in 1905, whereas in February 1917, October 1917, and after the deaths of Lenin, then Stalin, the tools of government often changed dramatically. Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II all made use of some form of secret police, which for the most part was the Okhrana. The Ukraina began as a softer version of the third section, but after the ascension to the throne of Alexander III and the onset of his more repressive regime, the Ukraina became more similar to the third section in terms of how repressive and intrusive they were. 1905 caused no change in the secret police, apart from perhaps slightly less persecution of political groups that were by then allowed to work with, and so long as they were cooperating with, the State Duma. Censorship also remained at similar levels, so whilst the number of periodicals in circulation increased threefold from 1900 to 1914 in what was a relaxation of censorship, there is no evidence that 1905 caused any particular increase or decrease in censorship. When this is compared to February 1917, when censorship was removed and political freedom granted, this was a huge change, as it removed in one swoop many of the tools of government. October 1917 reversed much of this with the establishment of the Cheka, and one of Lenin's first actions was to abolish the free press. So this was less of a change than February 1917, because it was a return to many things that had already occurred in Russia. Yet it was more of a change than 1905, by quite a distance, because even though October 1917 caused more of a reversion to old structures than a significant change, 1905 did not cause any change at all in the tools of government. Contrastingly, Stalin's totalitarian grip on power, fueled by his megalomania, meant that his grip on power tightened, and he used the tools of government to enhance this. Under Stalin, for example, all literary groups were closed down in 1932, and all writers had to join the Union of Soviet Writers. Those that did not would find themselves in the gulags, or worse, with a massive 5.5 million in the gulags at the time of Stalin's death. Much of this came as a result of the work of the NKVD, which performed the functions of secret police, as did every other version of the secret police. Only the NKVD were more ruthless and held greater power. Similarly, Stalin's death caused a change in the tools of government that was greater than that of 1905, because Khrushchev relaxed much of the censorship and repression which had served to prop up many of the previous governments. For example, in contrast to Stalin's 5.5 million in the gulags in 1953, there were just 11,000 in Khrushchev's gulags in 1959. In addition to this, there was a relaxation of censorship to the extent that twice as many books were released during Khrushchev's reign per year than had been released in the 1920s. And now to my summary of this paragraph. All in all, the 1905 revolution did not change the tools of government that were used to prop up the regime, as censorship and repression were carried out by the same bodies at roughly the same rate, whereas February 1917 and the rise of Stalin caused huge changes in the tools of government. In the case of February 1917, this was because they removed many of the tools of government. In the case of Stalin, this was because he took the existing tools of government and ramped up the amount of power that they had to increase the centralisation of government and to make sure power rested and stayed in his hands. Fourth paragraph. Lastly, local government should be considered, and in this case the 1905 revolution caused very little change in Russian government, particularly when compared to the consequences of the Emancipation Edict of 1861. As with tools of government and ideology, the 1905 revolution did not change local Russian government much because it was primarily concerned with an alteration to the national government. In comparison, the Emancipation Edict left a power vacuum in rural Russia because the authority of the nobility had largely been removed. So to fill the void, Alexander introduced the Zemstva in 1864, which had an elected membership, though this was weighted in favour of the landowning